okay? So, we're going to continue with chapter 14 in our book. We're focusing on segment 3, which is urbanization. We're going to move through segment 3 fairly quickly because we've talked a lot about it throughout the semester. Urbanization refers to masses of people moving within into cities. And this is really the story of our country and the story of Western society in general over the past 200 years. People moving from the countryside into cities. So currently, 77% of the population of westernized or industrialized cities, westernized or industrialized nations of the world live within cities. In the United States, that number is 80%. Nearly 80% of the population of the U.S. lives within the cities. That wasn't true 200 years ago. Only about 5% of the U.S. population lived within cities, and about 10% of the European population lived within cities 200 years ago. So there's been this massive migration pattern that has occurred within countries over this 200-year period known as urbanization. Masses of people moving from the countryside into the cities as we move from an agricultural economy to an industrialized economy. And so today we have these huge cities all around the world. And we have different terms that sociologists and demographers use for these large cities, including metropolises. A metropolis is simply a central city surrounded by smaller edge cities and their suburbs. Pittsburgh is a great example of a metropolis. We have the center city that has approximately 300,000 people within the population, and then we have a series of smaller cities and suburbs that surround Pittsburgh, known as the Greater Pittsburgh area, which encompasses nearly 2 million people. Aside from metropolises, we have the term megapolis. So sometimes cities grow in size, and their edge cities and suburbs grow to the extent that they run into each other. So a megapolis is when that occurs, when two or more metropolises grow to the extent that they, in fact, begin to touch each other. And in fact, there's several different megapolises throughout the United States. One very important one in the South is the Dallas-Fort Worth megapolis. If you drive from Dallas to Fort Worth, you will never leave, typically, urbanized population. Right? Either you're going to be within the city of Dallas, the city of Fort Worth, or in one of their suburbs or edge cities as you move from one to the other. This is also true for what's known as the Northeastern Corridor. The Northeastern Corridor. It's a megapolis that encompasses Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York City, and Boston. You can pretty much drive all the way from Boston down through New York, down through and to Philadelphia, and then down to essentially Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and never leave either the city, an edge city, or one of the suburbs of those cities. This is known as a megapolis, when cities grow to the extent that they really kind of encompass each other. And then finally is a megacity. And these are the huge modern cities that typically have 10 million or more residents. The United States has two megacities, two true megacities. New York and Los Angeles. However, if you take into account the suburbs and the greater metropolis regions, we have several other megacities in addition to New York and Los Angeles. Chicago would be one, Dallas-Fort Worth would be another, etc. But we have two true megacities in the United States, those that include 10 million or more residences, New York and Los Angeles. Okay? Here's just a nice little illustration of the megacities of the world. These are cities that, in this particular map, 5 to 8 million people, 8 to 10 million, and then 10 million or more. You can see Los Angeles and New York are included in that. Chicago, 5 to 8 million. Toronto, around 5 to 8 million. But the interesting thing on this map is that the vast majority of megacities are actually located in the east, right, in the east. Eastern Asian countries, including India and China, have the vast majority of the megacities of the world. So how do cities grow? How do we get to have a city? And how do cities evolve once they're created? And this is also kind of in the purview of the demographer or the sociologist. What we see is that at first cities kind of grow from a relationship between surrounding villages and other cities. One kind of becomes the central hub and becomes the center for the population, and then begins to grow outward. Initially, as cities form, they're relatively concentrated. But eventually, people move from the cities outward from the center city. And this is what is known as suburbanization. Suburbanization. People who initially may have lived within that city center move out from that city center, in which they may still work, they may still shop, they may still spend significant portions of their lives or time within the city center, but they live and sleep outside of the city in the suburbs. And then eventually cities kind of sprawl outward even farther. And this typically occurs for particular portions of the population. So we find that cities kind of grow in what's known as concentric rings, almost like the rings of a tree. The poor tend to stay located close to the city, and the middle class and upper class tend to move outward from the city. And this has to do for lots of different reasons, but one major reason in present day is the access to transportation. Middle class and rich have greater access to the automobile and have greater access to use that automobile more often, have more funds or more resources to pay for gas, to pay for repairs, to pay for new vehicles, etc. So they tend to live farther outside of the cities. So we have different theories about why this is the case, and one reason, especially in modern day, has to do with access to transportation. And the major mode of transportation in modern society is the automobile, right, or the car. This is known as the concentric zone model. It was first discovered in the 1930s and 1940s by Ernest Burgess. And he was a sociologist at the University of Chicago. And he says that, essentially, if you look at formation and growth of cities, they grow like the rings of a tree. They grow like the rings of the tree. In the center, you tend to have the central business district. And then, based on social class, you have different rings of neighborhoods, with the poorest rings located closest to the business district, and the upper class rings located farther away from the business district. Aside from growth in this kind of ringed way, other sociologists and demographers have discovered that cities are kind of grow in different ways. One way is the sector model, first coined by a guy named Homer Hoyt, another sociologist. And he says that the concentric zone model still applies. Cities grow like the rings of a tree, from inward to outward. But in fact, each zone or each region can contain several different sectors, including business sectors, shopping districts, etc. And it's more or less likely to see these different districts pop up in different areas. So for instance, with very few counterexamples, Hoyt pointed out that airports are located in the more distant rings of the city. And that's for two reasons. One is a practical reason. Planes and airports take up a lot of room and take up a lot of real estate, and thus moving to the outer rings makes sense in that way. But also, who flies? It's the middle class and typically the upper class that spend the most of their resources on plane flights. So it makes sense that airports would be located more closely to the upper and middle class, outside of the business district, outside of the poorer districts of the city, and closer to the districts or regions that are typically occupied by the middle or upper class. And then there's the multiple nuclei model, coined by Harris and Ullman, and it says that some cities have multiple centers. So there's lots and lots of examples in modern day US society and European society, as well as cities around the world, in which we see multiple city centers, And if you want to look at how these kind of can be illustrated, I'll give you some nice illustrations of these. The concentric zone model absolutely just looks like the rings of a tree. Right? In the center, we have the central business district. In the second ring, it's known as the zone of transition, which is a combination of poor housing as well as housing for the poor, as well as other business or industrial facilities. After that, you have the third ring, which is the zone of the independent workers' homes, so the working class homes. After that, it's the zone of better residences, and then the commuter zone on the outside. The sector model, Homer-Hoyt's model, you can see that it grows in concentric rings, but you can also split it up along the lines of different sectors. So one side of the city, maybe it's the east side or the west side or the north side or the south side of the city, may have high-end homes, whereas the opposite side may be the south side of the city or the east side of the city may have a greater concentration of industrial or lower class, low rent homes included in that city. So there's different ways in which a city can be conceptualized. A multiple nuclei model, model C here, you can see there are a whole bunch of different centers. Right? It doesn't grow, or this example of a city is one that is probably more planned than growing naturally, where the cities is determined to have different sectors. Right? Where it's determined to have different sectors. So there's many different ways in which a city grows, but some of the general trends that we see over the past 200 years or so is that, in fact, they have been growing. So one of the major trends in urbanization is moving from country to city. 1790, 5% of the population of the United States lived in the country, or lived in cities. Today it's nearly 80%. And we've seen another trend, which is movement from city to city. So another major migrational pattern that we've seen in the United States is the movement from the northeast to the west and to the south. So cities that used to be very, very large and vibrant, places like Pittsburgh, have shrunk over the past 50 or so years. And we've seen cities in the south, places like Atlanta, and in the west, places like Phoenix, grow very fast. So there's been another big migrational pattern that's been occurring as of recent, movement from the northeast to the south and to the west. And there's multiple reasons for that. Changing patterns of industry, including changes in technology, changes in patterns of industry, and also desire to kind of seek out warmer, more temperate regions. And then another major trend that we've seen is from city to suburb. So many Americans today, nearly 50%, live slightly outside of the city center, in the suburbs. And why is that the case? Well, there's problems that occur within cities. We've talked about those problems of overcrowding, problems of crime, problems of high rent, problems of disease, and other types of social problems that occur within the cities. And in a lot of ways, those act as push factors, pushing people out of the cities into the suburbs, where people can still be dependent on the city, but yet live slightly outside of that city and its associated problems. And Ernest Burgess kind of pointed this out in the 1940s whenever he noted that middle class and upper class people are more likely to move outside of cities and stay in the suburb areas, whereas the poor may want to move out, but may not have the resources to move away from those problems that occur within the city. Okay? So, as I mentioned, there's been a large movement of people from the Northeast to the South and to the West. And this is true for our region, the Pittsburgh region. So I've put a graph up here that demonstrates the population change of the city of Pittsburgh over the past 50 years. We can see in 1960, Pittsburgh had around 600,000 people living within the city center. By 2010, it's nearly half its size in terms of population. So Pittsburgh has shrunk in terms of population size by half over a 50-year period. We had twice as many people living in the city of Pittsburgh and living in the surrounding region than we have today. That is known not just to Pittsburgh, but to many different cities in the Northeast. So if we look at the fastest shrinking cities, the vast majority of them are located in the Northeast. Youngstown, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, PA, Cleveland, Scranton, Utica, Charleston, West Virginia, Flint, Michigan, all are at the top of population shrinkage for the cities. And the fastest growing cities are actually in the, many of them in the South and in the West. Raleigh, North Carolina, Las Vegas, Nevada, Fort Myers, Florida, Austin, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, Fayetteville, Arkansas, all make the top for the fastest growing cities, and they're all located in either the South or the Southwest, Western United States. So this presents problems for the growing cities in the United States, and it presents problems for the shrinking cities in the United States. Growing population has its own set of problems, as well as shrinking population. Growing population's problems include lack of services. You know, whenever you are preparing services or a variety of services for a population, and then you have to provide it for a greater amount, you get a strain on those resources. And for the shrinking cities, you have a city that is designed to support twice as many people and only has half that many people. You're going to have crumbling infrastructure from a result of the shrinking tax base within those cities. And so growing cities have their problems, shrinking cities have their problems as well.